Hello and welcome back. Today I'm going to paint some traditional deck chairs. So I want the stripes to show out as fairly vibrant. So I'm starting with a slightly subdued sky. I've got French ultramarine and a tiny bit of Viridian. Just going round the cliff. I've got white chalk cliffs here. And then just taking the paint up from the horizon, adding a little bit more. I just want the sky to be a foil. I don't want it to dominate the striped deck chairs. So I'm now going to add a little bit of Alizarin crimson to it, just a tiny bit. Let the water do the work, and that will help the light cliffs show and the deck chairs. So the cliffs aren't pure white, they've got some weathering, so I'm going to use Naples yellow. If you haven't got Naples yellow, use the thinnest mix of yellow ochre or chrome yellow, just to get rid of the white page. So coming round to the beach, in this case it's a pebble beach, I'm going to mix up a homemade grey and use that alternately with yellow ochre. So I can start the grey off by using the rest of the sky colour, just make it nice and weak. And I'm going to add a tiny bit of Alizarin crimson to the yellow ochre to make it biscuit colour. And I'm just going to drop in some areas. Go around the deck chair. I'm just going to pick up some of this with a drier brush just to leave a more speckled effect. And then continuing, doesn't matter if you lose some of the bottom of the deck chair because they're always in the sand or the shingle. Now I've got a bigger area, I'm going to be more calculating with the colours and drop in some of the homemade grey just to give a random. Obviously there's thousands of stones on this pebble beach, we don't want to paint them all. And then returning to a slightly different mix. I'm altering it as I go to give variety. This is more yellow ochre. All the colours I'm using are in the description, together with hints and tips and information on the location. And again, going around the supports. And just adding a little bit of grey as I go, just to break it up, and a little bit more of the warmer mix just all adds to the idea that it's not sand. A little bit of pinky in the middle because that's going against the blue chair, so that will make it look more interesting. And then going back to the first mix, changing it as I go, just making a slightly more subdued colour, a little bit more blue just so it looks slightly shady, and then going back to yellow ochre and letting it mix on the page, and then down to the water level, just dropping in a few more colours. Now I've got to go quite carefully round the chair, so I'm going with a slightly different colour, again letting it mix on the page, that the canvas seat is blowing in the wind. It's worth taking a minute to go around the deck chairs because it can add shadows afterwards. And a little bit of yellow ochre again, just dropping it in at random. But because they're stones, you don't want long streaks, you need a dappled effect. Now I'm now going to work on the cliffs a little bit more. The base colour has dried. Now I'm just going to stick a tiny blue suggestion of a gap there. And then in the sea there is a slight darker area where the rocks are showing at that state of the tide. I'm just going to put a little mark there. I've mixed up a green using French ultramarine because it's in the sky, yellow ochre and Viridian together because it gives a warm green. And I'm now just going to go down from the top, adding a little bit more yellow ochre as I go, just to give some variety. And then I'll make this skyline darker because the foliage is hanging on there. So I'm just dropping it in. I'm using a small brush because there's lots of facets to the cliff and it's worth just being careful. And I just need to make sure that I keep the tones separate so that the deck chairs stand out. So I'm adding not any more blue because there's blue in the deck chairs, but on this occasion Payne's grey, or any darker colour that it isn't blue, just so that you've got variety in the picture. And there isn't so much greenery on the very front of the cliffs, understandably. It's a very harsh spot, but there's lots of foliage. It's working its way down, and there's obviously crevices with shadows. So it's made a reasonable start, but it needs to be a little bit darker. So just adding, in this case, more Payne's grey. Just dropping it into the already wet paint. Now just adding some shadows with a homemade grey from earlier. And the chalk is also weathered horizontally. So I'm going to get a slightly different mix, just tinting the homemade grey with a little bit of yellow ochre. I'm just going to put in some horizontal lines, just the way it's eroded. I'm going to put some green on top of those, but not everywhere, just every now and again. And I don't want them everywhere, so I'm just going to lift it off a little bit, just to give more variety. Cleaning the brush as I go. So I can come back to that shortly. And I'm going to mix up a richer colour, just to do a few little areas. Now down at the waterline it's quite dark, so I'm going to use burnt sienna and indigo together and just put in a little line at the bottom. It's quite random. And then add that to the little rock that I found at the end. Just get a wet brush and just lose the bottom edge. Now I'm moving on to the deck chairs. And a good way of doing them is with a flat brush. I've got a dail around the flat brush, and always try it dry if you're not sure, and see whether you're happy that it fits the space nicely, and that seems to. Now I don't want to smudge these with my hand, so I'm going to mix up 2 or 3 different colours, because there's light where the sun's catching it, but it's all faded. So I need a homemade grey and a light yellow, which I'm going to use Naples yellow, and a brown. So I've mixed together the burnt sienna and indigo again that I used on the cliffs. So I'm going to start with the darker area first. So with the flat brush it's very easy just to go in, and you can follow the line nicely. And it goes around the top. It's quite curved and disappears behind the fabric and comes out again. And the same on the back strut. This time it's a narrower dark area, which is another reason for having a flat brush. These flat brushes are quite inexpensive. The other makes are available, but this is just the one I've just found. And when you're more sure, you can go all the way down and just fill in any gaps. But they are weathered, so not everything is even. Now I've got the back area here. It's disappearing slightly in the shingle. And then the support. One support goes over the other. I'll put the shadows in later. And there's almost a pencil line width beside the seat fabric. So moving on to the next one, it's a different style. So I'll start with the top. And then there's a tiny bit on the back, hardly anything. And the same there, hardly anything. And this time dark on the side. You have to look where all the shadows are. And then dark underneath. It's just worth looking at a view for 5 minutes or 10 minutes before you dive into the paint box. Just make sure that you understand where everything is. And the far one's got because we're looking at it at a more oblique angle, it's got hardly any dark showing, but I'll just stick a little bit on. When you're painting anything as angular as a deck chair, don't take your wrist in a curve. Take the brush off and reposition it at the new angle. And just a tiny bit on the back of that one. The rest of it is all the lighter colours. You do just make sure that everything's dry before you go to the next area, otherwise it'll all smudge. Now this leg is half in shadow. So as it's half in shadow, I'm just going to make the paint a tiny bit lighter and go halfway up the leg. I'll go back to the first chair, which should be dry by now, and I've got sun hitting some parts of it directly, so I'm going to use Naples yellow or the lightest similar colour you've got, as long as it looks different to the beach. And again, that's got shadow on the second leg, but I can put the light colour on to start with, and the same with this one. Then it goes to darker colours, so I've got to let it dry and I'll put the mid colour in. But while I'm waiting for it to dry, I can put the very dark in at the top where the fabric's wound round the frame. So I'm mixing up more burnt sienna and indigo, make a dark brown. If you've already got a very dark brown like Van Dyke brown or something in your box, you can use that, but I haven't today. So I'm just going in just where the fabric meets the frame at the top. Hardly anything showing that side. And the same with the red one. It's only dark on the very edge. And this, on the left hand side, it's lighter, so I'm going to use the homemade grey just to dilute the paint a little bit. And the far one, I've got no frame showing at the top. I've given the framework of the chairs a moment to dry. I'm now going in with the homemade grey to give a third colour on some of it. Just makes a difference to have a variety of shades. And the same with the next chair. Just go down. Can be a bit confusing when they overlap each other. And the bottom is a bit lost in the shingle. Now I'm moving over to the last one, which is further away and different angle, so there wasn't so much variety of light. I will rub the pencil lines off afterwards, but when you're doing something with straight lines, it is important to know that you're putting the paint in the right place. So next, the stripes. I need an entirely different brush, I think. I'm going to try this one because it's got a good point. And I want it to be very vibrant against the sea and other colours. So I'm mixing up French ultramarine and turquoise together to give a brighter blue. And most deck chairs have got 5 stripes. To make sure there's not too much on the brush. And just follow it gently down. It is fabric, so don't panic if you haven't got a straight line because it's blowing in the wind. Just go gently until you've decided that you're happy with it all. So I'm starting with the far edge, as in this case, going down to infinity where it goes around the corner, and then without reloading the brush, going back again. You can always have a second coat, but I don't want puddles of colour. I want it to be as solid as I can. And the area where it's turned over the chair frame is darker because it's not got any sunlight showing through. Just take your time and go carefully, because it's the stripes that take people's eye. And then the last one's got some shadow on it, but I'll just put it in as it is at the moment and add the shadow afterwards. And the next one's red, but to start with, before I do that, I'm going to put the top of this one in and just show you that it is a different colour. So I'm going to use a little bit of French ultramarine, quite strong, not too much water in it, and the colours are offset. So I'm painting a square and then filling it in, leaving the gap for the white. And so most deck chairs that I've come across from painting have got 5 lots of stripes, but there's a lot of contemporary deck chairs around at the moment that are quite different. Now the red one is the same, so we do the top first. I'm using a mixture of Scarlet Lake and Azilian Crimson, but any bright red you've got will do. And I'll rub the pencil out afterwards. But now this one's faded, so I'm going to let the paint down as thin as I possibly can and add a little bit more of the red just to make it more pinky. And they've faded so much that you can hardly see anything on the seat squab itself. So I'm just going to put in almost pink water there just to show that it's faded. And then get a piece of kitchen roll and just take it off a little bit. And the stripes, so they are faded, I'm going to make those more with rose madder to show it's more of a faded red. So I'll just add a little bit to the seat squab first, wet into wet. So there's hardly anything left of that. It's been on the beach a long time. And then go down with the stripes, which I can only see 4 because they faded so much. So I'll start here where I can see one. And then just put in tiny highlights every now and again. Take some of the first one off a bit just to show. I didn't intend to paint the faded one. I was more interested in the positions they were in. And so it just goes round the corner because it's blowing in the wind. So I've got a shadow here. So I'll just take the stripes down into the shadow for now. And then the last one is the nice blue again. I can't see all of it. I've got some of it there. And I can see, because it's at an oblique angle, I can see the stripes on the seat. So the next thing is to focus on the sea, which has got lots of long lines of current and the way the wind's catching it. So just give it a moment to dry before I reach across and accidentally smudge it all. For the sea, I've mixed French ultramarine with sap green, or any warm green will do, and I'm starting short of the horizon, using a brush with a good point to go round the deck chairs, and then starting from the other side, going back again. Then going up to the horizon. Then it's got streaks in it. Sometimes the wind causes streaks, so I'm going to go over one line again just to make it a little bit stronger, and then coming back with a little bit of Viridian. Just making a line of Viridian, not going too near the cliffs because the water there will be a different colour. So go back to the first colour to go by the cliffs, and then making up a little bit more so I get a slightly different tone. If you haven't got sap green, just add a little bit of yellow. But I want the sea to be different from the seat, making sure that all the water is going sideways. I don't want any hard lines, so I'm going back to the big areas first, and then just take the brush sideways on top of it. Make sure that I've got a finish that's completely different to the stripes going up and down. And then the sea is slightly different colour by the cliff, so I've added slightly more green and bringing it forward, cleaning the brush and then going back to more blue. So the picture is of the deck chairs, so anything else is just a bit of a foil for it. And I've left a white line on top of the deck chairs because the sun is shining there. I'm changing the colour yet again, adding a little bit of turquoise this time. I've got Cobalt turquoise, but any turquoise will do. It's where the water's slightly shallower, and a little bit over here just to give it a lift. Now I've got to go in around the stripes, which I have got to do up and down because of the shape, but afterwards I can go over it with a few sideways strokes just to separate it. And that's where the green comes in handy, that you can just show that it's entirely different. And this one's more spectacular because it's blowing in the wind. And finally the sideways strokes. And one more area. Make that a bit darker just to separate it from the stripes. And I'll just go around looking for any hard edges that I don't want while it's still wet. Just make sure it's all in order. And lastly, one little triangle to find. So just cleaning the brush off now and going along here. Cleaned it and dried it just to move the paint so it's not got any particularly difficult areas. Now that's got to dry, and when it's dried I can just put on a few more tidal areas where you get a streak from the wind goes all the way across. I've now mixed up a different blue out of Prussian blue and Payne's grey, but any dark different blue will do the job. And what I'm doing is just using a big flat brush just to put in marks across as though the wind is just blowing the water. Get them going backwards and forwards. It's very weak paint, but it just will leave a pattern, which again breaks it up from the plain fabric. It's nice to emphasize different surfaces in a painting. Going back in with a slightly different mix. With a flat brush, you can hold it at a reasonable angle and steer clear of the deck chairs because it's got a controlled fine end. So just leaving the idea of the wind blowing over the surface of the water, as there is wind because the deck chairs are taking off. And obviously I can't get into all the areas with this brush, but I've done the majority of them. So I'm now going to change brushes and go in with a number 2 brush just to go in the nooks and crannies, just to, so it doesn't look any different when you stand back and look at it, that it looks like the sea is continuous. And then if I find that I've not gone close enough to the fabric, I can always just add a little bit and just dab it back a little. It looks too bold. Now the only thing I've got to do now is put on the shadows, a few on the cliff and shadows on the chairs. So I've got to let it dry before I can do that. I've just let the beach dry completely and the chairs, and to make it look more like a stony beach rather than sand, I'm just putting odd little marks on. You can't draw every stone and it would spoil the picture, so I'm just using some homemade grey, a little bit of Naples yellow, putting it on, then diluting it slightly, keeping the brush on the move all the time, then picking up something slightly pink, which will make the blue look brighter, just dropping that down. Just keep rotating the colours, slightly bolder on this side because it's nearer, and then take the water through just to break up the area. Really what you're doing is picking out the negative areas around the stones I'm doing the same thing with the horizon, just to make it a bit brighter, to separate it from the chairs. I put a line of French ultramarine on. I'm now just losing the bottom edge of it as it comes closer to the shore. And then halfway through, it's a similar area but more green. It's just the way the wind is catching the water, just blowing it along. In England we call it cat's paws on the water, but it's just the water moving in the wind. And then another one slightly more grey towards the shore. And then just lose that as well. I'm just going to put one more darker green one in, so I'm mixing Viridian with Payne's grey. Obviously if you're painting at the beach on a different day you'll have different colours, but it's always useful to have a starting point. And by going sideways it makes the vertical deck chairs look more interesting. So I've got to let that dry now, and then I can just tidy up the shadows underneath. I've just mixed up a little French ultramarine and Payne's grey, and because I'm going to put shadows underneath the deck chairs, I need the sea to have a few darker streaks on it just to harmonise. So I'm just going sideways, a few little dots and dashes every now and again, just to follow the tones. It's quite diluted down paint as I go further out to sea, a little bit darker under the cliff. And so you don't need too much, just less is more sometimes with painting. This is a lovely beach to go to. It's got fishing boats on the beach as well. Now for the shadows I've mixed up Payne's grey and a little bit of yellow ochre, and I'm just going to put in a little bit of shadow underneath. Not too much. Slightly less on this one. It just sort of anchors the chairs, and then this one's at a more oblique angle, so that's only got half a shadow. Just take off the edge of it so it's going to infinity, and these will just give a little bit of a shadow the other side as they're flapping in the wind. Some bits have got more of a shadow than others. I've got a few shadows to put in. This deck chair has got a shadow that isn't dark, more blue. So I'm using French ultramarine and a little bit of Payne's grey just to put in a little shadow. And then the faded one has got a grey shadow. So I'm just going to make that a little bit bluer so it shows up against the pebbles. And the one on the end has just got a bit of a shadow on the top bar. In fact, the red one's got a little bit of a shadow as well. So I'm going to give the shadow under the chairs another coat. Sometimes it can soak in a little bit, so I'm just mixing up some Payne's grey and yellow ochre. I'm just going to go over it again just to make it slightly bolder. So I hope you've enjoyed watching the deck chairs and that you'll go and find some soon. Thank you very much for watching.